Thanks, everybody. It is Monday, June the 8th, 2020. Thanks for your patience. I'm Keir Murray. I'm a local political and public affairs consultant. I'm joined by my dad, Richard Murray from University of Houston. Now that we've got our technical difficulties ironed out, how are you today, Dad?
I'm just fine.
Good, good. Well, obviously a very eventful week once again in American politics. And I thought, since last we talked, there had already been unrest going on over the horrible killing of George Floyd. A few hours after we wrapped our meeting, as I recall, last Monday evening, the president made some brief remarks, I think, in the Rose Garden, and then had what reportedly police, tear gas protesters who were stationed near the White House and clear an area so he could walk to St. John's Church nearby and stage what I think most people characterize as a pretty strange photo op holding a Bible. Didn't really say anything. I think the idea was to assert sort of a law and order stance related to this crisis. What's your read on the sort of situation with George Floyd and how that's developed over the last week and what it means politically?
Well, I think it's the center point of probably the president's worst single week in as chief executive. Uh, the photo op to me was about as bad as Michael Dukakis in the tank back in 1988. It's not going to go away, I think, in the next 5 months. So not a good week for the president, obviously, despite his comments about George looking down and smiling when he was touting the good economic news a couple of days later. It was just an all-around very bad week for the president and for his reelection campaign.
Yeah, and we've seen a spate of polling come out in the last week, and I've talked about previously the fact that the race, despite everything that's happened in the U.S. over the last several months, has remained remarkably stable. But the latest round of polls suggests that's changed. I saw Nate Cohn, a well-respected analyst from the Times this morning, put out a little graph where he'd looked at 6 major polls that had come out in the last week, including Fox and ABC and the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, as well as a few others. And the average lead for Biden in the sort of March-April timeframe was a little over 6 points. And based on this latest round of polling, it's a little over 10. And that's an enormous shift in a race where both candidates are well known to the American public, and you have an incumbent president running for re-election. What's your sense of how the race is maybe shifted over the last month or so?
I think it's shifted to a definite advantage for Joe Biden. That obviously things could change. There's still almost 5 months left until we conclude voting, but political science is pretty good at sort of analyzing when people make decisions and how likely they are to change. Going back to one of the Roosevelt campaigns in 1940, I believe, a bunch of researchers from Columbia University went up to Elmira in upstate New York, and they were going to do 3 waves of polling. The first was in early summer, about the time it is now, and then they followed that up with a couple of others. And they thought that voters would wait and get more and more information, but no, most voters had made up their mind by the beginning of the summer and didn't change. And I think that's a very bad sign for Trump, who is, like FDR, a very well-known incumbent president. And voters access a whole bunch of different information, but once they settle on a candidate, and most people do that well before election day, it's not so easy to move them off that.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that the Real Clear Politics polling average, which is a pretty well-regarded aggregator of polling across the country as well as in individual states, has the aggregate lead for Biden a little over 8 points. So a little bit less than the Nate Cohn analysis from those 6 polls, but pretty close. And by comparison, both in 2016 and in Barack Obama's 2012 reelection number, that lead was about 1 point. for either Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama at the same juncture in the race. And one of the things we've seen pretty clearly borne out by the polling we've seen is just this enormous gender gap that's opened up. President's roughly breaking even with men, doing maybe a little bit ahead, but either even or slightly ahead. But in some polls I've seen nationally, he's behind with women by as much as 20 points.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me to see how he wins re-election with that kind of a lopsided gender imbalance.
Yeah, there's a little parallel to one of the presidents of our lifetime, or my lifetime, that got defeated. That's Jimmy Carter. Carter ran about even with women against Ronald Reagan in 1980, but lost men by a huge margin, 20 points. So you've kind of got the reverse situation now, where the president is okay with men, at least breaking even, but way down with the other gender, and that's a recipe for defeat. Also, we are often reminded it's not the national poll numbers that ultimately matter. You got to win enough states to get to the electoral college minimum of 270. But when we look at the half dozen states that are considered to be battleground, we still see that this shift in polling to Biden's advantage works there. And that, yeah, it's a little closer, about 6 points, but that's still factoring in these are the most competitive states. And as with the national polling averages, pretty clearly something substantial has gone on in the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, I noted over the weekend an eye-popping poll out of Michigan that showed Biden up by 12 or 13 points in the state. Obviously, this is a state that Hillary Clinton very, very narrowly lost in 2016 as part of, Trump's threading the needle of the Electoral College to be elected president. But as someone was looking at the poll pointed out, that the same organization that conducted this poll that had done it in 2016, I think never showed Clinton with much, if any, of a lead. And Biden in this poll, I think, was up close to the mid 50s in terms of his support. Hillary Clinton never reached 50% in that poll ever in 2016. And so I've heard a lot of people, progressives sort of say, well, we thought Clinton had a lead in 2016 in the polls and it didn't turn out that way. But all the analysis that I've seen over the last month or so suggests that the lead has now grown to a degree that it's sort of outside the unknowable zone when it gets really close and things can bounce around a little bit. At least as the race stands now, we seem to be well outside that margin.
Yeah, these shifts are almost certainly meaningful, and they make some sense. That you've had these continuing great crises of health and the economy, but now we've injected a totally different element: racial justice, police conduct, that cuts across a lot of normal voting lines. And it's just seemed here that Trump sort of went back to the Dick Nixon playbook of 1968, said, I'm going to run as a law and order president. But, 2/3 of the electorate from that era are gone. And you've added all the millennials and now Gen Zers. And these folks are much, much different, particularly on racial justice issues and police conduct. And what worked 50 years ago, I don't think is going to work very well in 2020. Plus, Nixon was a far more skilled, disciplined presidential candidate than Donald Trump will ever be.
Well, and Nixon was also a challenger, right? In that year, not the incumbent. So again, it's harder for Donald Trump to make the argument that if you don't like the way things are going, you should keep me, right? Maybe he can pull it off. But the other thing, of course, is that the country is profoundly different demographically than it was in 1968. There are just a lot more people of color who live in the United States than did then, right?
Yeah, the electorate was about 90% white in 1968, which meant that unless you got, if not a majority of whites, you had to get in the high 40s or you didn't have any chance of winning. Nowadays, if the minority voters unify, which is rare, but Trump seems to be pulling off the hat trick of bringing together Asians, Hispanics, and African Americans, then you only need about 35 or 36% of white voters to win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very interesting indeed. And, we've had, obviously, we'll get to COVID in a little bit, but one fallout from the COVID crisis has been this profound economic recession, lots of job loss. Um, a little bit of good news, welcome news last Friday showed a couple million of those lost jobs have been gained back. A lot of people said, well, that's understandable given the PPP loans that have been out there and the reopening of various states and communities around the U.S. On the other hand, we've still got uh, more people filing every week, a couple of million a week for new unemployment claims. Here in Houston, we saw this morning, for example, that BP has announced they're going to lay off 10,000 workers. A substantial number of them will likely be in Texas. What's your sense of how things are going economically and how that may relate to the president's political situation?
Well, I think the great majority of economists are with Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, that we've got a very serious long-term problem with the economy that's not going to be resolved in any sense until well after the election in November. This kind of collapse of so many economic sectors can happen quickly, but recovering is almost certainly going to be drawn out and will take, in some instances, years to restore. So the president kind of spiked the ball the other day at the press conference, I guess on Friday, after we got some fairly good numbers. But also, those numbers are quite questionable. The Bureau of Labor Statistics said, we had a lot of trouble gathering data this time. Revisions in these data often occur. Sometimes they make the data better, sometimes worse from an incumbent administration perspective. But I wouldn't take these numbers to the bank. There are just a bunch of things out there that are atypical. A number of people right now are doing okay on the short-term stimulus money that they're getting, and they're not likely to be counted as unemployed in some circumstances. So let's see. But the damage to the economy is deep and pervasive, and of course, what underlies it is the continuing great concern about reopening the economy in an age of a pandemic, which ain't over,
Right.
particularly not in Texas.
And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But it was uh, interesting to me that the president, arguably gets his first good news politically with these jobs numbers that he's had in weeks, if not months. And the operative in me says it's just feeling for his political team because he takes that good news and goes out and steps all over it with this rambling press conference where he, as you mentioned, says George Floyd's looking down from heaven and saying what a great day for America this is, while millions of people are still out of work. We have this pandemic going on. We have civil unrest in the streets all over the country related to police violence. And, he's just saying this is the best day America's had in years. And I thought to myself, his political team's got to be just wringing their hands because what can they do? Any normal situation, a president would make a short statement saying, we've taken a tough hit. We've got a long way to go, but the American people are resilient. We're starting to turn it around. We're all in this together. And you have a good news cycle, but he pushes his own good story off the front page because he can't stop himself from intervening.
Yeah, that you mentioned the political team, well, when Trump ran in 2015 and 16, it was a chaotic, disorganized campaign with a bunch of third raters like Lewandowski and Paul Manafort. But, they sort of managed to win anyway against a arguably flawed opponent in Hillary Clinton and a lot of breaks that worked to his advantage. This time around, he's got plenty of money. The Republicans have on their bench some of the very best political operatives in America. They're not working for Trump in this cycle. In fact, several of them, as we've noted, are working against him with the Lincoln Project. And of course, one reason for that is that he's a one-man band, that he doesn't listen to his team. And when your campaign managers in San Antonio, Texas, and Washington, D.C. is chock full of professional Republican consultants, that tells you something. This time around, I think the chaotic, disorganized campaign is going to put re-election in great danger.
Yeah, and just we've talked about this a little bit before, but one of the reactions I saw among some Republican Hill staffers and others to the jobs number as said, well, this means we're on the way back economically, so we're not going to need any more stimulus. And it seems to me that that's a very dangerous proposition. If the stimulus, one could argue, is a lot of the reason that things aren't worse than they could be, and it's set to expire in a couple of months. And if you don't put any new money into the system, you risk going right off the cliff again economically right before the election. And so I'm curious, there's been this talk about a fourth stimulus going through Congress. House has obviously acted. Mitch McConnell has been dragging his feet with the Senate. I don't think they have immediate plans to take it up. But is this going to derail a fourth stimulus from the Congress? And if so, what's that going to mean economically for the country? And then as an extension of that, what's that going to mean for the politics going into the November election?
I think it's delayed the fourth stimulus, not derailed it. And I think the critical factor that's going to drive McConnell and the Republicans is that the crunch is really coming for state and local governments. All of them are in terrible trouble. Some have already begun to lay off people. They got a little money, but not nearly enough to in the first rounds of stimulus. But way before November 3rd, cities, states, counties are going to have to make some very tough decisions, and they simply don't have the local resources. That's going to force McConnell's hand. I don't know what we'll end up giving, but almost certainly state and local governments are going to get a substantial new tranche of funding, because that will take McConnell's Senate majority down. And he cares something about President Trump, but I think McConnell, who's a savvy, longtime operator, can count. And now he's got about 10 members of his caucus that are at some risk of being defeated, including, previously so expectedly secure members like Lindsey Graham.
Or John Cornyn.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and even McConnell himself, potentially, who's not particularly well regarded in his home state. And then, I want to just, before we leave the national picture, COVID-19 has not gone away. We have seen, thankfully, in places like New York, finally coming down off just a terrible period of a couple of months, and they seem to be emerging from that worst crisis point. Meanwhile, in some other places like Arizona, like Florida, and like Texas, we're seeing a rather alarming growth in case numbers again. How do you read, I think we've got about 110,000 Americans who've died from this outbreak. That story has been pushed off the front burner over the last week or two by the civil unrest related to police violence, et cetera. But that said, the crisis has not stopped, and we obviously don't have a vaccine yet or a therapeutic treatment that's viable. How is COVID going to continue to play out?
Well, it's sure going to continue, because tragically we're not seeing any significant decline from this plateau. The averages mean we're pretty much holding steady, but that's in the face of a dramatic improvement in the Northeast, particularly in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, where clearly things have gotten much better, partly probably because there's a fair amount of immunity now. The epidemic has raged through that population. But in places that were okay at the beginning, like Florida, Texas, California, we're on the upslope. And now we're just beginning to get data from when we've really sort of opened up and people are attending more restaurants and other events. So it's not a pretty picture, and but it's very uneven. And again, national averages are, like somebody was pointing out, like taking an average in Europe. Well, in Europe, you had countries that were devastated early, like Italy, and then Spain, that had gotten somewhat better. Other places like England that started worse later, very bad. And pretty much the same pattern in the United States. We're a very big and very uneven country. But the parts of the region that were largely spared back in March, April, now are in a much different and tougher environment, and also with a reduction in social distancing, people being less careful about wearing masks, and a lot more outside interaction. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, yeah, we're just going to have to see how that continues to go. I do want to turn to Texas. We talked a little bit about polling nationally. One of the things we saw over the last week were a couple of polls from Texas showing a tied race, basically, in both cases. Um, Bloomberg had an article over the weekend quoting a member of the Biden campaign saying that, they plan to compete in Texas. They thought they could win here. What that will mean in terms of resources, I think, remains to be seen, obviously. Put on top of that, this reaction to the George Floyd killing. We've seen lots of demonstrations around Texas, and not just in the big cities, but in places like Vidor, the very sort of historically racist community, home of or a lot of KKK folks in the past. So not just limited to the big cities, but really all over the state. And then we had this situation where you had 7, I believe, Republican county chairs from Texas who, to one degree or another, had put out these conspiratorial or racist, potentially, postings on social media about the George Floyd killing being just a made-up crisis to hurt the president, et cetera. And Abbott, the governor, calling on these chairs, some of them at least, to resign, and some of them have done so. What do you make of the political situation here in the state of Texas?
Well, there's a lot of stupid behavior in politics, particularly by political operatives who are not themselves office holders in the sense of being elected by the broader electorate. And that's party officials, of course. They're selected in primaries with very few people voting. This means that a lot of more radical people often win these positions that have views well outside the mainstream. I think the savviness of the Governor Abbott team, as you suggested to me, reflects the fact that this is poison with the broader electorate in a state where, according to the numbers I looked at this morning, 41% of the residents of our state now call themselves white and not Hispanic. That means that 59% in the most recent census estimates are labeling themselves as something else, mostly Hispanic and Black, with a growing Asian contingent. So playing with racial politics in a state like Texas is, playing with matches in a room full of kerosene or gasoline.
Yeah, and what do you make of the sort of tie ball game potentially here in Texas, and whether whether the Biden campaign really will compete? We noticed, for example, that we've got this George Floyd memorial service going on in Houston today. Joe Biden is coming to town. I don't think he's actually going to attend the funeral, but he is making an appearance here in Houston. Contrast that with the president, I believe, holding his first in-person fundraiser since the COVID crisis hit in the Dallas area. I want to say within the next week or so. You got both contenders coming to the Lone Star State. Looks like we may be on the map in terms of competition, which is, what seems to me a very bad development for the president. If this is a state that ordinarily he would count on to win comfortably, to not have to contest, it's a very expensive state to compete in. But if he's having to come here, if he's going to have to spend resources here just to win, it suggests it goes along with the notion that he's just got bigger political problems overall.
Yeah, in Texas, we've got this split now between the metropolitan areas that now, including the suburbs, have gotten significantly less supportive of Republicans. Outstate, very, very strongly for President Trump and Republicans, but outstate, minus the 8% or so of the state that's Hispanic, is only 23% of the electorate. So even if you get 75% there, if you lose the metro areas by more than 55% for the other guys, you lose the state. And remember, Texas has had more growth in metropolitan areas since 2010 than any other part of America. We've added almost 3 million Texans in Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. That's 85% of the growth of the entire state. And that's where Trump is weak, because those voters are better educated. They're somewhat younger. Of course, many of them are women, but there's also an awful lot of minorities. Statewide, 17% of our voters, of our population, were born outside the United States. In Harris County, it's 26%, and going up 1% a year. And a lot of those folks now are registered voters. Many of them migrated, but naturalized. They've had children who were born in the United States, are automatically citizens. So we're really in play, in my judgment, because you've also got a Senate seat that's winnable, and you've got control of a vital legislature that will do an important redistricting in a state that was highly gerrymandered 10 years ago. So there's a lot on the table in Texas. And I think for the first time since the Dukakis-Benson race of 1988, the Democrats will make a major effort in the state.
Yeah, and we've talked about before, in addition to the potential winning statewide, you've obviously got the battle for control of the Texas House, as well as many as 6 or 8 congressional seats that could be quite competitive, depending on how things go. I did think it was interesting that Sam Wang, who I think is a well-known analyst from Princeton of politics and elections, pointed out that there's a very, very small geographic swath encompassing parts of Tarrant County, Dallas, and Collin counties that just within this strip of that represents just a tiny percentage of the state's overall land mass, you got potential in there alone to flip the Texas House if you win these 8 or 10 seats. And you wouldn't even necessarily have to compete in the other parts of the state. And if you add sort of the Houston area and Fort Bend onto that, even more seats are potentially winnable.
Yeah, it's a small geographic area, but it's densely populated and has a lot of legislative and congressional seats. And as I pointed out before, these maps that were drawn in 2011 and modified a little bit in 2013 were very, very skillfully drawn gerrymander. But what the maps didn't account for is a tremendous amount of population growth and movement. And the districts that started off being fine aren't fine in 2020. A bunch of them failed in 2018. That's why you lose 14 legislative seats and 2 congressionals. And they've gotten even worse. In every precinct in Harris County, with the exception of about 6 out of over 1,000, there's a smaller Anglo population today than in 2018. So the maps were wonderful when they were drawn, but they didn't account for the dynamic population growth in metropolitan Texas, or for the unpopularity of Donald Trump with well-educated suburban voters, most of whom used to be pretty reliably Republican.
Yeah. So, so if you had to, obviously we're just guessing at this juncture, like, what do you think the chances are that A, the Texas House flips in November, and B, that that Biden carries the state?
I think the Democrats have a better than 50% chance of getting control of the House. They've got a couple of seats they have to defend, but those districts are better now than they were 2 years ago when Democrats won them. Better in the sense that they have fewer white voters and more minorities. Biden, of course, partly will depend upon the decision of the Biden campaign. Do they make a major push in Texas? But it is notable that the first metropolitan area he's visited since March, when the virus shut down the campaign, is Houston. He's been up to Philadelphia, but he's not been more than 50 miles from his home until today, and he's in Texas. And I think that tells you something.
Yeah, and again, I've just been watching. The governor has, I would say, the best political team in the state, and watching their messaging around these George Floyd protests, and then the reaction to these county chairs' behavior, suggests to me that they've sensed tremendous risk for their majority in the state house, potentially some of their congressional members around the state, as well as for John Cornyn and even carrying it for the president. I don't know how, to what degree, but their behavior suggests that they sense trouble.
Well, they don't have much of a margin to play with. If we look at the Cruz-O'Rourke race, which the vote for Cruz tracked very closely with the vote for Trump in 2016, and no reason to think it's going to be any different in 2020. So Cruz wins by 200,000 votes out of about 8.6 million. You ain't got a lot of margin to play with there. My estimate in Harris County, where Cruz lost by about 200,000, is Trump's on track to lose the county by more than 300,000. That's wiping out half of your statewide margin in one county. And I think you'll see the same pattern in Dallas and in the big suburban counties. So Biden has probably not a 50% chance, but I think somewhere between 30 and 40% of winning the state, which would just devastate the whole geopolitical strategy of the Republican Party in the 21st century. California's gone. There's no way you can imagine it returning to the Republican fold until you get way beyond Trump. If Texas becomes the new Florida, a jump ball state that you have to put huge resources into. No reason to think Florida is going to be any different. It's a tough political map.
Yeah. And I thought, we talked a lot over the last several weeks about this battle over mail ballots. We know what the Supreme Court in the state of Texas did here. We've talked about that. The Fifth Circuit federally, I think, is put the hold on things until they figure out what they're going to do. But I did note that here in Harris County, we got a new county clerk who began his job about a week ago. And not long after that, he announced that they're sending a mail ballot to every Harris County voter who is 65 and older, who are automatically eligible to vote by mail in the upcoming July runoff. It suggests that there's going to be an aggressive push, at least here in this county, to expand vote by mail, which may be very important if we're still dealing with COVID as we get closer to the fall election.
We're just starting a survey at the hobby school this week of asking all the elected officials around the state how they're responding to this environment. Are they going to aggressively try to expand vote by mail? We've also had the governor announce, again, I think reflecting his concerns about the image of the party is not in great shape, that Texas will do an expanded in-person early vote window. Right now, we were scheduled to start early voting this fall on the 19th of October and run it through the 30th or so. And the governor's going to push that earlier into October. So we're going to have a longer window, which will cut down on some of the potential problems with the virus and social distancing and risk of infection. So we're going to have a lot more people voting by mail this year. We're going to have expanded early voting. There still maybe a disaster at the polls in November. That's a potential possibility because I think 11 to 12 million Texans are going to want to vote this year. And we've never had more than 9 million in the history of our state.
Yeah, and we saw, we talked previously about the problems in Wisconsin during their primary a couple of months ago, but I believe last week we saw in Washington, D.C., where they had an election going on, just terrible lines that lasted well into the night with people because of social distancing requirements. And I think maybe a reduction in the number of polling places, partially because you can't get staff to work these locations, which is, it's one thing to open a location, but if you don't have people to staff it, it doesn't do you any good. That, again, suggests that we've got potential problems on our hands for November unless we take steps to make the voting process just easier for Americans, regardless of where they live.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge for these election officials in counties that have very large numbers of voters. And it means that things like, instead of relying upon older, mostly retirees to staff this kind of part-time employment, you're going to have to hire a lot of people like students. Kind of the good news of the economic crash is there are a lot of unemployed people out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, as we've said, like, despite the sort of political wrangling over this issue, it's not a controversial one with the public. So all surveys I've seen show strong majorities of Americans of all political stripes support expanding vote by mail to people who want it. And we've seen some raising of the voter fraud specter by the president and others, but we noted that there are now accusations being leveled at members of his own team that they themselves have engaged in suspect voting by mail in recent elections.
Well, actually, Republicans have done pretty well by vote by mail, and neither side can tie a hand behind their back. Out in the field, Republicans are going to work hard to get as many mail ballots out to their voters as possible. So,
yeah. Okay, well, I'd like to turn to a few of the questions that we've gotten. One is, we talked a little bit about Biden's visit. Ellen asks if you think it'll help him politically, or will it be seen as a stunt?
I think Biden needs to come to Texas. This is a state, again, that Democrats have not seriously contested since 1988. Biden's not from here. He's campaigned a little bit here probably in his previous presidential efforts. So it's a good visit for him, particularly under the circumstances where you have the murder of an African-American literally on live, on filmed as it was happening. He happens to be from Houston. He's being buried here beside his mother in Pearland. So it's and Biden's, it's probably his greatest strength as a candidate, and he certainly got weaknesses, is his empathy, because he's got a compelling personal life story that has deep tragedy. And he just comes across as an authentic human being when he's talking about people suffering, people losing loved ones. So it's kind of a made for Biden moment. And I think that's one of the reasons that they, changed their game plan, where he had not left the Wilmington metropolitan area really in 3 months and came to Houston today.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think, to the extent that he's been visible in the wake of this George Floyd crisis, it's really been as a sort of calming influence and calling for unity, which frankly is a contrast to what we're seeing from the incumbent president. And so I think to the extent he can keep that that vibe going, I think it probably helps him, because I think a lot of Americans are genuinely dismayed and worried about what's going on, both in relation to police violence, but also about how this is yet another crisis that's tearing away at the fabric of American society. And most people want to see calm restored and see us figure out a way to get on the same page. And so I think to the extent that Biden can project the ability to do that, or even just the willingness to do that, probably helps him politically. Someone asked, do we think the left's call to defund the police departments will hurt Democratic candidates, Biden and others running for office?
Potentially, that's a step too far, I think, for a lot of voters. You can change police departments. I guess Camden, New Jersey, shut down their traditional police department, which had a bad record of racial interaction, and went to a county level operation. The cops that were there had to quit and be rehired. You're going to have a police force of some type that's locally controlled. You can call it the Camden Police Department, or you can call it the County Police Department. But just the idea of getting rid of police departments, that's a non-starter for most American voters.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I agree with you. I think it has some potential to be harmful. But the other thing I would point out is that who knows what we're going to be talking about in 3 weeks, much less 4 or 5 months when the election happens. This may be a distant memory, this situation, based on the way things have gone over the last couple of years. So again, I think of all these events that previously would have been sort of defining events politically in the U.S., impeachment, for example, nobody even remembers anymore. Yeah. And that was just a few months ago. So one of the things we can say about the Trump era is that things change, and very quickly.
Trump doesn't.
Right. Someone asked about the unemployment claims in the last few weeks, 30 million or so plus, 2.5 million gained back. And this is the only figure that the president is talking about, but also in the media, are we still suffering a huge net loss of jobs? And this person says it seems that Trump is winning the propaganda war on the economy, and wonders about a comment on that.
Well, we're, again, 4.5 months to the election. We'll have a lot more numbers, and probably a lot better numbers on the economy in the coming weeks and months. Most professional economists think we've got a very serious continuing economic problem well into next year. I'm not an economist, but I read what professional economists say, and I read Jerome Powell at the Fed, who has a background, of course, and has some of the best economists. So I don't think you can spin this based on a short-term set of numbers. People live in the economy, know if there's work, they know if there isn't. And we're still in a lot of areas on the downside, as with lots of state and local governments having to lay off people in coming weeks.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, just again, I think the stimulus that's been put into the economy, into the pockets of average Americans, I mean, it's been far from perfect, don't get me wrong, but it has worked, right? It's ameliorated some of the pain in this crisis, but it's temporary. And so again, if there's a delay or an unwillingness of the Congress to do more to ease that pain, it seems to me we could have a lot of new suffering going on that we've escaped to some degree so far. A lot of people obviously are already suffering terribly, but I think again, the stimulus has made it be less bad than it could have been. And once that runs out, if it's not re-upped, I think we can have a whole new slew of problems on our hands.
Yeah, one of the most important parts, I think, to cushion the shock was that $600 per week add on to unemployment benefits. That runs out at the end of July. So you've got about 7 more weeks of that. That's hugely important. It's enabled a whole lot of people to pay the rent, to be able to afford some level of childcare, and it's expensive. But it's probably been one of the most effective programs to actually help people that were in desperate straits. But again, it's temporary, runs out in 7 weeks.
Yeah. And then things like, there's been a moratorium in a lot of places on things like evictions. Not Texas, we were one of the early states to rescind that. But again, you have people start losing their housing potentially because they can't pay their rent. Just becomes hugely, hugely problematic. What about this idea of moving the Republican convention out of New York, or out of North Carolina, excuse me? Is Texas a possibility there? I've seen Dallas mentioned as a possible location, Florida, some other possibilities.
The mayor of Dallas has expressed a decided lack of enthusiasm for a move. It's a crazy situation. Obviously, the virus is unprecedented, but Trump is absolutely insisting on he wants a coronation with a big crowd, doesn't want to give a speech to a half-empty arena. And, the mayor of Charlotte and the governor of North Carolina are not willing to bow to the demands of the National Committee, and that means the president. So I think, to my surprise, despite the incredible logistical difficulties of moving a convention this late, they probably are going to move it, and I guess would be to Atlanta or Jacksonville, maybe Orlando, states that have Republican governors and Republican legislatures. But I wouldn't want to be the person handling logistics. Just reading from around the country, a lot of Republicans in states like Indiana are saying, don't think I want to go to the convention this year. So I don't know if they're going to fill the stadium with a bunch of mostly seniors. That's the people who show up at party conventions as delegates and alternates and so forth. So it's a major problem, and it's Texas. I don't think so. Again, the cities here are mostly governed by Democratic mayors. I don't think they're very enthusiastic about the idea of on very short notice, and probably with no assurance you're going to get money from the Republican National Committee to cover your increased cost of taking on this venture. So if it moves, it probably goes to Florida or maybe Georgia.
And I'll just do a couple more here. One of the things we saw over the last week, I think in response to some of the president's attempted use of or desire to use the military to quash civil unrest, was some top military current and former members pushing back publicly against him. What do you make of that, and how meaningful is it, to the American public?
I think it's one of the factors that contributes to what seems to be a very real loss of support for the president. This is not a bunch of the usual leftist Democrats. These are generals that in several instances that Trump personally hired and bragged about, like Mad Dog Mattis, going public saying, in my lifetime, I've never seen a president that has deliberately divided Americans. And that's pretty powerful. And Trump has always pitched himself as a pro-military guy, pro-police, but for the first time in many years that, as I can recall, you've had the senior command pushing back very aggressively. And in this instance, these were people that were inside the administration and know something about what they speak.
Yeah. And then lastly, Biden, who became, I believe, the presumptive nominee with the contests that happened over the last week, he's now acquired enough delegates to win. Not that that was in doubt, but he did so as sort of, running as a middle of the road conventional Democrat. do we think the fallout from COVID and George Floyd, et cetera, will push him further to the left? And with folks like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez from New York giving him advice, and among others, does that potentially hurt him in the general election?
Possible. I think he's got to make this really big decision, more important for a 77-year-old who may be a one-term president if he's elected. Who do you pick as your vice president? And he said it's going to be a woman, and now there's a lot of discussion about will it be a woman of color, and a couple of women have been elevated by recent events, the mayor of Atlanta and Congresswoman Val Deming from Florida. He's going to announce that in about 5 weeks or so, he says, 5 or 6. I think that's more important. Most people don't pay enough attention to know what's going on in the negotiating between, Bernie people. And Bernie's being a lot more of a team player in 220 than he was in 216. So Biden's in a pretty good position. The Democratic Party, thanks to great degree to Donald Trump, not Joe Biden, is a relatively united party, for a party of great diversity. Trump is a perfect foil for Biden. Biden is good at doing some of the ceremonial things, the unity things, and Trump's terrible at those. So he's got some flexibility on issues. He's not going to ask me for advice, but I don't think you want to get too pinned down on very specific things you're going to do, because first you got to win. Second, to get anything passed, you got to have Congress. If you don't win the Senate, a lot of that's not going to be feasible. But Trump is 80% of this election. And, I think if you're the Biden camp, you're okay with that.
Yeah, that was going to be my response. As long as this race is about Trump, I don't think there's a lot of downside risk for Biden. The Trump people, of course, will try to make the race much more about the contrast between the two candidates. And if that becomes more front and center, and, there are certain issue positions that some might classify as being out of the mainstream, yes, that could potentially be damaging to Biden. But as long as the president, this race is about the president himself and a referendum on his incumbency, then I don't think it's a huge risk. And as we've seen, the president's sort of de facto behavior is to make almost everything about himself. So his own team, I think, is going to struggle with their candidate to execute the strategy they need in order to win. And I think they're already running into this problem, as we talked about a little bit earlier with the press conference on Friday. But if your candidate doesn't cooperate with you on the way to win, it becomes that much more difficult.
Well, again, it ain't much of a team. It's the daughter and her husband and a few other people that Trump talks to on the phone. The traditional political team is not in existence in Trump world. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Just as a note, next week I think is going to be our last of these sessions for a period of the summer. We're going to take a break probably until August, but we will do one more of these next week. And who knows what our schedules are going to look like by the time we reconvene in August. But I hope we can all hope a little more normalcy continues to return. On a note of personal pride, I put on long pants this weekend for the first time in 3 months. I was just happy they fit. So in any case, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Thanks.
Me too. I put long pants on since it started.
I know.